Despite Vulcan characters playing a key role in multiple Star Trek films and TV shows, we see surprisingly few Vulcan ships during the course of the various Star Trek shows. In fact, we know very little about Vulcan ships and the Vulcan fleet in general. Now, likely this is due to both a majority of the shows being set during a time when Vulcan is a member of the United Federation of Planets, and therefore relies on Starfleet to perform many of the roles that a dedicated Vulcan navy would have done. But also this is likely due to the focus in the shows on individual Vulcan characters, rather than the potential power of the Vulcan military. Despite this, though, we know just about enough to give their ships a broad overview, even if we are going to be heavily reliant on the portrayal of the Vulcans during the 4 seasons of Star Trek Enterprise for this video. Vulcan starships possess many unique and visually distinct attributes compared to many of the other Alpha Quadrant powers. Easily the most noticeable trait of which being their use of keleopteric or annular warp drive to propel themselves at faster-than-light velocities. This being opposed to the more conventional linear-style warp drive, such as is more the norm among most other powers. This style of drive, offering as advantages a more stable warp field, great power efficiency at low warp speeds, and redundancy versus conventional drives, does also suffer from several shortcomings versus these more standard drive designs. Most notable of which being a very high power consumption required to achieve higher warp speeds, and difficulty maneuvering at warp due, ironically, to the stability of the annular warp field. In later periods, Vulcan ships would attempt to modify the annular drive by splitting the warp ring in two, sacrificing some degree of redundancy in exchange for greater maneuverability at warp as a middle ground between the two systems which attempted to combine the advantages of both annular and linear drives, with a minimum amount of their collective downsides included in this Frankenstein drive design. Other distinct elements unique to Vulcan designs would be their copper-hued hulls, which are made of a unique material composite which effectively dissipates many forms of radiation, a vital necessity in the days before reliable energy shielding was the norm, and still useful in certain circumstances once such technology was available. Vulcan ships also tended to be very large when compared to many other designs in their era, with Vulcan cruisers in the decades before the formation of the United Federation of Planets being noted as being particularly large. Vulcan history is long, well documented, and fascinating, with their history of spacefaring being potentially the least documented and least understood element of their planet's history. Though that is not to say that Vulcan spacefaring does not have a wealth of information known about it. In fact, Vulcan engineers were among the first in the region to discover and develop reliable faster-than-light travel, doing so sometime in the first millennium BCE on the old Earth calendar, using this technology to spread and establish a large series of colonies in their local stellar neighborhood. Vulcan society, and the planet especially at the time, was heavily divided and violent, with factional conflict for resources, land, reputational and personal reasons being very common. Combat was not limited to fighting within a planet's atmosphere and on the ground, however, but oftentimes involved warfare spreading to space. This period of violence would come to a head in the 4th century CE Old Earth date, when the Time of Awakening brought massive reforms to Vulcan society across the spectrum of wealth, privilege, societal status, and religious background. Though a brief resurgence of violence around the war to expel those who fought beneath the Raptor's wing, the progenitors of the Romulan Empire, would see a return to large-scale stellar warfare which placed further strain on Vulcan society. Understandably, the stresses that this would place upon Vulcan and its people would prove to be too much to continue, with the early followers of Surak advocating a return to traditional life to reform society into a new order, allowing much high technology, possibly including space travel, to wither and die as unnecessary. It would be over 1,000 Earth years before Vulcan would reach out for the stars once again, doing so in gradual stages, re-establishing contact with former colonies and greeting new arrivals on the galactic scene which had emerged in their long absence. The new Vulcan would take a more measured approach to space travel, avoiding rash action, but instead applying logic and reason to their exploration and interaction with other powers in an attempt to avoid undue conflict. This would be a policy which would yield mixed results, with many powers taking the Vulcans' approach to diplomacy the wrong way and seeing them as rather conceited and self-involved. Several powers the Vulcans helped early in their own journey among the stars, the Andorians chief among them, would later drift apart from them and later become serious rivals due to this approach. These missteps and contact with other outright hostile powers would see Vulcan construct the first dedicated warships in many centuries. By the 22nd century, Vulcan would be the most powerful nation in their local stellar neighborhood, possessing a large network of colonies, allied powers, and protectorates. The Vulcan fleet would expand rapidly in the early and middle part of the century in direct response to the buildup of the Andorian battle fleet, both powers becoming locked in something of a Cold War for many years. This fleet would reach the zenith of its power immediately prior to the outbreak of the Romulan Earth War, although a number of crises on Vulcan itself would see the power of the Vulcan Navy at home diminished significantly. With the formation of the United Federation of Planets shortly following the end of the Romulan War, Vulcan would integrate its military forces into the broad auspices of the Federation Starfleet, maintaining from here on out a modest force of domestic starships for ceremonial and internal use. But the peak of Vulcan military designs had passed in favor of collective defense and mutual respect. From this point on, while Vulcan did possess dedicated warships, existing for planetary defense and local law enforcement, the number and individual size of the Vulcan fleet would diminish significantly. The Vulcan would continue to operate small numbers of ships into even the 24th and 25th centuries. Many of these were dedicated scientific explorers, diplomatic transports, and civilian transports, not warships. As a result of this, Vulcan fleet doctrine in the present day could best be described as orbital and system defense. The fleet retained by Vulcan is mostly meant to act in the sorts of missions and roles which are beyond the mandate of Starfleet, which as an organization is geared mostly towards space command and control, leaving local duties to Federation member states where possible. Vulcan's warfleet thus, since the formation of Starfleet, has a mostly short-ranged focus and has little interesting in the way of tactics or doctrine to go over. However, in the centuries prior to the formation of the Federation, the Vulcan Navy possessed not only a numerous force of warships which, like their Starfleet successors, claimed a primary role as explorers, but boasted much of the capability and actual missions of big line ships. During this period, Vulcan tactics called for a strategy similar to the later space dominance doctrine employed by Starfleet, whereupon the large cruisers were expected to directly oppose and challenge enemy formations in direct combat. Smaller ships under this doctrine were expected to harass the enemy's rear, communication lines, and their trade lanes to serve to whittle down their ability to fight, and force them to devote forces to escort and guard these rear area vessels. What distinguished Vulcan tactical thought from that of Starfleet later on would be the conscious decision to steer away from standing large formations of ships in favor of more fluidic, ad hoc commands based upon what vessels were available in a given area at the time they were called on. In the Vulcan eye, this was a more logical approach than a rigid and unchanging formation approach to naval design. Although the era of large Vulcan fleets has passed, it cannot be denied that in the days before the formation of the Federation, the Vulcan fleet possessed a very strong force which made it the dominant navy of its day, and given the obvious similarity between Vulcan and later Starfleet ships, which both performed the dual roles of explorer and warship as needed, it can be argued that much Vulcan DNA went into the later ships of the Federation Starfleet. Vulcan ships represent a unique take on warp starship design, making use of novel technologies in distinctive ways. Their ships proving to be sturdy, survivable, and adaptable craft which exemplified the logical qualities of their builders. Thank you for watching this video. As I said at the outset, we don't really know all that much about Vulcan ships. I think canonically it goes to Planahoth in First Contact, the Dakir and is it Surak class in Enterprise, and then we have the Planahoth again in Next Generation. There's some mention of Vulcan cruisers in Discovery, I think, but Discovery. But yeah, there's really not much to go on. And it's not exactly like, say, the Cardassians, where it's like, oh, these are the ships and this is what they use and they're a big deal. We really don't know all that much. We have a couple of classes that we're introduced to, and that's before the Federation is even a thing. So a lot of this video was talking about the Vulcans from Enterprise, which I don't know if anybody else... Enterprise has really grown on me recently, and I don't know if that's just at the time thinking, this isn't very good, or if it's a little bit of, thinking it's not very good, but then later on rewatching it and thinking, this is better than I remember, or if it's an example of, Stockholm Syndrome, like the longer you're locked in a room with something, the less you tend to hate it. I don't know. Anyway, it's grown on me a little bit. Also, Vulcan designs are just so cool. As always, let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments about Vulcan ships in general. Do you like them? Do you hate them? Also, the channel has a Patreon that you can subscribe to and get videos early. This video will be going out early as well. You can also get artwork. You know the drill at this point, honestly, I would hope. So, I mean, really, I think that's all I've got for right now. Oh, over on Patreon, if you do watch that, though, I am building a Oberth class to the scale, sort of with interior, at the scale that I think it should be in Minecraft, because 3D software is scary. So feel free to check that out if you want. There's a link in the description. And really, I think that's all I have to say on this video. So, take care.